Всем привет, и мы начинаем играть в игру Кома. Посмотрим, что это за игра. Я пока что комментировать не буду, потому что звук не хочу настраивать полчаса. Я хочу, чтобы вы понаслаждались игрой. Так что это проверочное видео. Если вам понравится, в дальнейшем, возможно, мы будем проходить эту игру. Ну а пока что, как всегда, проверочное видео, да, первая часть. Так что всем приятного просмотра, и мы начинаем.
Sought information for a living. That is to say that ever since he returned from Korea, after having served with the armed forces, he had been working as a private investigator in Montreal. William Hamilton, a rich industrialist, had gotten in touch with him regarding a simple vandalism issue. Nothing to write home about. Not worth hiring a private eye either, just so he can drive for hours on rough roads. But that's how it had always been. The client pays, Carl gets it done. They had set up to meet at the general store, his client's business. Well, actually the entire village had William Hamilton's name written all over it. Were bad, muddy, or snowed in, it was customary around these parts to close them off. But it was also customary to ignore those signs entirely and drive there anyway. Carl was meeting his client in a store near this area. He was on the right track. Hamilton never mentioned a road-blocking barrier. Why was it needed here in the back of Beyond? That would, however, be a mystery for another day. Carl had waited long enough for someone to come and raise it. Hamilton no doubt knew who managed the barrier. Carl wanted to give him a call, but that would have been too easy though, as sure enough the line was acting up. Still not a soul in sight. There was no point in waiting any longer. Carl had to figure this one out by himself. Hamilton is waiting for Carl in the general store. It was time for him to get down to business. Never in his life had Carl thought he would one day drive further north than Shibugamu. Hamilton enjoyed a lavish country house built in the very heart of the northern forests, not too far from here. The local populace was divided when it came to the affluent man. Some saw a wealthy philanthropist dedicated to improving the region's economy. Others an aging Englishman who would do anything to further his fortunes. And those ones hated him enough to go on about scheming against him. Hamilton had recently acquired a few local businesses, but the last straw was the reopening of a mine, which gave rise to a wave of protests and threats from the Cree people. Given these circumstances, Carl reckoned that a good number of people must be feeling compelled to oppose Hamilton in one way or another. So far, only the industrialist's house had been a target, but soon enough, Carl thought, the target would become the man himself. Now wasn't a good time to wander about. Hamilton was still out there. Carl needed to get out of there. The cold and the pain required urgent care. The driver had taken off. It was still best to check it out and leave nothing to chance. Carl needed help. Such heart-wrenching Nordic poetry that was. But Carl didn't care much about flowery language. This deep in the country, his last hope was to find an abandoned garage or a farm by the roadside. His life depended on it. Wondered how long he would have to endure this skin-stinging cold. always carried his log on him, in which he scribbled down thoughts and leads alike during the course of his investigations. The cold was burning Carl. He would not hold up much longer. He had to warm himself. Even better than he had hoped, Carl Faubert had succeeded once more, and was now on his way to new adventures. Fire can't be started with a snap of the fingers. Like many of his contemporaries, felt like he had more trouble breathing when he wasn't smoking. Cigarette was his own personal breathing assistant. his legs, but he had to stay focused on the task at hand. Now wasn't a good time to wander about. Hamilton was still out there. Spread out on a few acres of untouched forest, bellowing caribou, everlasting snow, and undefiled lakes, the Manistan region was no tourist hub. It was said to have been populated for millennia by Cree people, and ever since the industrial era, by the metal mining industry. Carl was dying to stretch his legs, but he had to stay focused on the task at hand. Carl's military training had made him a very punctual man. Being late to his meeting with Hamilton was out of the question. The general store was close by. Pumps wouldn't surrender their divine nectar so easily. In all likelihood, they had to be switched on from inside the store. A milkman had to drive by every week to fill the bottles. The fresh milk indicated a recent visit. Something fell to the bottom of the box. Carl had no trouble recognizing his employer. He had been killed. There was no need to be a detective to figure that out. But only a detective could have noticed that the killer had to have been very close, that the fatal blow had been given before the victim even realized. The note explained that the garage and the store couldn't be supplied with electricity at the same time. Carl was used to strange phenomena, but a chunk of ice like this, as if an iceberg came out of the ground, that was a first. Prince? Carl found a surprise at every turn. Was the camera faulty, or was there a possible lead? An explosion suddenly occurred outside. Carl knew that Gilles Lachance was in charge of the general store. That made him one of Hamilton's employees. A very angry employee, as Carl could plainly see. According to that log, it seemed like the whole village owed some money to the general store. Carl was far more interested in the bunch of nearby addresses he had just gotten his hands on, though. The snowstorm pummeled everything in its path. Carl was not surprised when he heard no tone. Pumps wouldn't surrender their divine nectar so easily. In all likelihood, they had to be switched on from inside the store. The note explained that the garage and the store couldn't be supplied with electricity at the same time.
Дорогие друзья, давайте я уже в следующей серии это все сделаю, просто сейчас не хочется долго все это делать. Короче, в следующей серии, если вам понравится, я займусь этим, буду проходить все и все. А так это первый смотр был. Если вам понравилось, то поддержите это видео лайк, чтобы продолжение было. Ну и так далее, и тому подобное. Вы все это прекрасно знаете. Подписку на канал больше всего желательно. Вот так. Всем удачи.